There are people who spent their entire lives inside faith. They prayed, they fasted, they believed, and one day they stopped. Not out of rebellion, but because certain questions became too serious to keep ignoring. Questions you may have thought about and chose not to pursue. But there is something almost no one notices. These questions did not appear yesterday. Philosophers, scientists, and even theologians have been discussing them for centuries. And the most curious thing is not that these arguments exist, is that many believers have never heard them. In this video, I will show you the 8 most serious arguments ever raised against the existence of God, and by the end, you will understand why this debate has still not been settled. The problem of evil. An innocent child dies of cancer. A massive earthquake swallows thousands while they sleep. A righteous man loses everything for no apparent reason. If God exists, is good, and has the power to act, why doesn't he act? This is the problem of evil. It is the oldest wound of faith. The Greek philosopher Epicurus was already raising the question centuries before Christ. If God wants to eliminate evil and cannot, he is not all-powerful. If he can, but does not want to, he is not good. If he both can and wants to, then why does evil exist? There is a story in the Bible about a man named Job. He was righteous, honest, and feared God. He lost his children, his health, his possessions, everything in sequence, without having done anything wrong. And in the middle of all this, he receives no explanation, only silence, and later a response from God that does not justify the suffering, but simply reaffirms the mystery. The philosopher Alvin Plantinga developed the most elaborate response: the free will defense. God could not create genuinely free beings and at the same time guarantee that they would never choose evil. Real freedom includes the real possibility of error. A world with free creatures who sometimes do wrong may be more valuable than a world of perfect beings with no choice. But this answer does not explain tsunamis. It does not explain childhood cancer. It does not explain genetic diseases in newborns. David Hume was direct. If evil exists under the rule of God, then either he is not good or he is not powerful. Both conclusions undermine classical theism. Dostoevsky, himself a man of deep faith, put into the mouth of Ivan Karamazov a line with no easy answer: if the suffering of a single innocent child is necessary to build paradise, I return my ticket. The problem of evil does not prove that God does not exist, but it demands that those who believe in him explain how divine goodness and real suffering can coexist. And that explanation, to this day, does not satisfy everyone. The stone paradox. Can God create a stone so heavy that he himself cannot lift it? The question sounds naive, but it is one of the most precise logical traps in the philosophy of religion. The reasoning is simple. If God can do everything, he can create this stone. But if he creates it and cannot lift it, he is not all-powerful. If he cannot even create it, he is not all-powerful either. Either way, omnipotence disappears. Think of it this way. Omnipotence means the power to do absolutely anything. But anything includes things that contradict themselves, creating a force that defeats itself, bringing into existence something that makes its own existence impossible. The problem is not physical, it is logical. And when logic collapses inside a divine attribute, the very concept of God begins to crack. Thomas Aquinas responded that God cannot do things that are logically impossible, not because of weakness, but because the task itself is incoherent by definition. Creating a square circle is not a limitation of power. It is nonsense. For Aquinas, omnipotence means the power to do anything that can be done, not to perform logical contradictions. John Leslie Mackey pushed back with precision. If omnipotence has logical boundaries, then God is not absolutely unlimited, and a God with boundaries is not the God that the Abrahamic religions proclaim. Aquinas' definition resolves the paradox by redefining omnipotence. But a redefined omnipotence is no longer full omnipotence. This is not a joke about stones. It is a question about whether divine attributes make sense when examined with rigor. And the fact that this question still has no consensus answer already says a lot. Divine silence. Imagine someone who has spent years praying, with sincerity, without conditions, simply waiting for some response, some presence, some sign that there was someone on the other side, and finding only silence. The philosopher John Leslie Schellenberg developed this argument with precision. A personal and loving God would not leave a person genuinely open to him without any response, but millions seek this experience and encounter emptiness. For Schellenberg, the silence is not a test, it is evidence. The argument works like this: if a loving father knew that his child was looking for him, he would not remain hidden. A God who defines himself as love, who desires relationship, who seeks the human being, would have no reason to remain silent before someone who sincerely searches for him. Prolonged silence does not fit the profile of God God that religions describe. Mother Teresa of Calcutta spent decades serving the poorest without feeling the presence of God. Her letters, revealed after her death, show a woman who continued even without the experience she expected. In the Christian tradition, this has a name, the dark night of the soul. The silence is not absence. It is a different form of presence, one that shapes and deepens faith in a way that immediate consolation could not. There is a category of people who did not abandon faith because of logic. They left out of exhaustion from waiting for someone who never appeared. Bertrand Russell, when asked what he would say to God if they met after death, answered calmly, "I would say that you did not give enough evidence." The Bible itself does not pretend that God is always perceptible. Job cries out in the darkness and receives no answer for entire chapters. The silence exists within the sacred text itself, and whether that is comfort or confirmation of the argument depends on who is reading. The large universe. The universe is 93 billion light years in diameter. It has existed for 13.8 billion years. Earth occupies less than half a millimeter on that scale, and humanity has existed for less than 300,000 years. If God created everything for human beings, why do humans occupy an infinitesimal fraction of space and time within a creation that is absurdly vast? The scale of the universe seems incompatible with the idea that humanity is the center or the purpose of all existence. Carl Sagan put it with precision. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all the emperors so that they could be, for a moment, masters of a fraction of a dot. 99.9% of the universe is empty or immediately lethal to any form of life. If it was designed for us, it was designed in an extremely inefficient way. The problem is not only the size, it is time. For 13.5 billion years, the universe existed without any human beings. Stars were born and died. Galaxies collided. Planets formed and were destroyed. All of this happened before any form of human consciousness existed. Imagine an architect who spends 13 billion years building a house and places the resident inside only in the final seconds. If the resident was the point, why the wait? The anthropic principle offers an answer. The universe needs to have exactly these dimensions for life to be possible. The physical constants are tuned with such absurd precision that even a minimal variation would make the existence of any form of life impossible. The size, age, and apparent hostility of the universe are not waste. They are necessary conditions for this moment here to be possible. Psalm 19 says that the heavens declare the glory of God. Modern astronomy revealed that these heavens are, in their vast majority, inaccessible and lethal to human beings. If this is glory, it is a glory that was not made to be inhabited. Omniscience incompatible with omnipotence. God knows in advance all future events. God can change the course of events. These two statements cannot both be true at the same time. If God knows what you will do tomorrow, that action is already determined. If it is determined, you do not have real choice. And if you do not have real choice, how can you be held responsible on the day of judgment? The theology of free will and the theology of divine omniscience collapse against each other. Imagine that God, before the creation of the world, already knows that you will lie next Tuesday. This knowledge exists before you exist, before you have any choice. Now ask, could you choose not to lie on Tuesday? If you could, God would be wrong, and an omniscient God cannot be wrong. So in practice, you could not do otherwise. What looks like freedom is, in the end, a script you did not write. Molinism, developed by the Jesuit Luis de Molina, proposes that God knows not only the actual future, but all possible futures. He knows what each person would do in any imaginable scenario and created the world in the scenario where human freedom and divine sovereignty coexist without destroying each other. The choice is real. God's knowledge does not determine it. He simply knows in advance what you will freely choose. But if God created the world already knowing exactly how each person would choose, he is ultimately responsible for every choice, including evil, including suffering. Total sovereignty and total human responsibility do not fit within the same system without one destroying the other. Romans 8 describes a sovereignty that leaves little room for easy human freedom, and this tension has run through centuries of theology without a resolution that satisfies both sides at the same time. Self-sufficiency of the universe. What if the universe did not need any cause at all? The classical cosmological argument says everything that exists has a cause. The universe exists. Therefore, it has a cause, and that cause is God. It is one of the oldest and most intuitive arguments for the existence of God. And it is exactly this argument that this critique attacks. David Hume was the first to formalize the criticism. Even if every event within the universe has a cause, it does not follow that the universe as a whole needs an external cause. It is a logical mistake to assume that properties of the parts apply to the whole. Stephen Hawking went further. Time itself emerged with the Big Bang. Without time, time before the universe, asking what existed before it may simply make no sense, like asking what lies south of the South Pole. Think of it this way: every person in a room has a mother. That does not mean the entire room has a mother. In the same way, everything within the universe having a cause does not mean the universe itself requires an external cause. The logic that works for the parts does not automatically apply to the whole. It is like trying to find the center of a circle and assuming that this point must also exist within a larger circle. William Lane Craig argues that the existence of something rather than nothing, and of order rather than pure chaos, points to an intelligence behind the structure of reality. Even if the universe is self-sufficient in its existence, it still requires an explanation for its laws. Why do the physical constants have the values they do? Why do laws exist instead of pure chaos? The reply is well known. Invoking God as an explanation merely pushes the problem back. If God can exist without a cause, the universe might as well. The question of who or what does not require an origin remains unanswered on both sides. The evolution argument: for billions of years, without planning, without intention, and without direction, life was shaped by a single principle. What works survives. What does not work disappears. When Darwin published On the Origin of Species, he was not proposing only a biological theory. He was removing the need for a designer to explain the complexity of life. What once seemed to require a creator, the human eye, the wing, the immune system, began to have a natural explanation. Richard Dawkins summarized it this way: evolution produced the appearance of design without any designer. The watch exists, but there is no watchmaker. If the complexity of life has a natural explanation, the main historical argument for a creator disappears. Michael Behe, a biologist and one of the leading figures of intelligent design, argues that certain biological structures are irreducibly complex. The bacterial flagellum, for example, only works when all its parts are present. Remove one and it stops functioning. For Behe, a system like this could not have emerged through gradual steps, because the intermediate stages would have had no function and therefore would not be selected. This points to intelligent intervention. Imagine assembling an airplane engine piece by piece, but each piece on its own serves no purpose and takes you nowhere. Natural selection only preserves what already works. So how would it preserve the pieces of a system that only functions when complete? This is the core of Behe's argument. Evolution explains adaptation very well. What it struggles more to explain is the origin of systems that appear to have no functional simplified version. There is also an implication that goes beyond biology. If the human being is the product of a process without purpose, concepts such as an immortal soul and the intrinsic value of life lose their foundation. There is nothing in the evolutionary process that requires the existence of a being with special dignity, only organisms that survived long enough to reproduce. Genesis describes God forming man with intention and specific care. Evolution describes a long process without direction and without a defined destination. The two narratives describe completely different origins, and the question of which one is true changes everything that comes after. The problem of divine incoherence. God is eternal and personal, immutable and yet capable of regret, transcendent and jealous, just and merciful to the point of contradiction. The problem of divine incoherence does not attack God from the outside. It examines what the sacred texts themselves say about him and asks whether these attributes can coexist coherently. Malachi 3 says, "I do not change." Genesis 6 says that God regretted creating human beings. Something is either immutable or capable of regret. The two statements do not coexist without tension. God is described as completely transcendent, beyond every human category. Yet he is also described as a father, a being who feels jealousy, who becomes angry, who loves. A being that is absolutely transcendent, by definition, does not possess human emotions. Augustine already warned that anything we can conceive about God falls short of what he truly is. Analogical language is the classical response. When the texts describe God with human emotions, it is not literal. It is a human approximation for realities that go beyond comprehension. God's regret in Genesis does not describe an internal change in him, but a change in the relationship between him and creation. Think of it this way: when a father says his heart is broken because of his child, he is not describing a cardiac event. It is language that brings a complex emotional reality closer to something the child can understand. Theology says that God does the same with human beings. He uses the language of regret, jealousy, and anger, not because these emotions precisely describe God, but because they are the closest words human language has to reach something beyond it. But Michael Martin pointed out the problem. At what point does analogical language simply become incoherent? If no attribute describes God literally, if everything is an approximation, then at what point does the statement God is loving stop meaning something real? Theology uses mystery as the answer. Critics say that mystery, in this context, is another word for an unresolved contradiction. The problem of divine incoherence does not ask whether God is good or powerful. It asks whether the God described by religions is even thinkable in a consistent way, and that question can only be answered with logic, which for many makes it the most difficult of all. You have just seen 8 of the most serious arguments ever raised against the existence of God, from the suffering of innocence to the internal contradictions within the divine attributes themselves. Perhaps the answer to all these questions already exists. Perhaps human understanding is simply too limited to grasp it. Or perhaps, in this life, some answers are simply not available to us. What these arguments do is not close the debate. They demand that it be taken seriously. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, and in the comments, tell me, which of these arguments do you consider the hardest to answer? Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.